Tonight on KQED Newsroom, Americans rise in protest against police brutality and racial injustice. San Francisco's new district attorney outlines his vision for change and discusses the steps he's taken this week. Also, we dive into the history of policing in America and controversial proposals to improve the system. And protesting during a pandemic, we hear from a doctor about the risks and how racial inequality results in poor health outcomes. I'm Priya David Clemens. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. It's week 12 of sheltering in place in Northern California. Coronavirus infections are rising faster than ever worldwide, with 100,000 new cases reported each day. There have now been 110,000 coronavirus deaths recorded in the United States. But as you know, the unprecedented pandemic was overshadowed this week by tens of thousands of Americans protesting the death of George Floyd, the unarmed black man killed during an arrest by a white police officer in Minneapolis. Floyd's death has sparked days of mostly peaceful protests across the nation. At times, law enforcement used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds who were calling angrily for reform and justice. Earlier this week, San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin announced significant proposals to improve the city's legal and policing systems. DA Chesa Boudin joins us now by Skype. District Attorney Chesa Boudin, have you personally participated in any of the protests this week?
Hi, Priya. Good to be with you. Yes, I have. I've been to at least 2 different protests already this week.
And what has the atmosphere been like for you? What has it meant for you to participate?
It's been wonderful. Righteous rage, creativity, diverse groups in terms of age and race and background coming together to demand long overdue change peacefully in an exuberant exercise of First Amendment rights.
While the protests have been mostly peaceful, there have been some incidents of burglary, of vandalism. I know at the beginning you had brought charges against people suspected of being engaged in some of those activities. In the past 6 days, have you charged anyone for criminal activity during the protests?
We have absolutely continued to file criminal charges against people engaged in looting or commercial burglaries or arson. As you said, that's a tiny, tiny minority of what's happening. It's a distraction, really, and I don't view the folks engaged in that kind of activity as being associated with the protests. There are people committing crimes using the protests as cover, but they are not part of these protest movements.
How many charges would you say you've brought over the last 6 days?
I don't have the exact number for you, Priya. I know that on Tuesday alone, we filed 18 felony cases.
Okay. Do you have concerns about the San Francisco Police Department's response to these protests? Are you investigating the police department for its handling in the past week?
I have not heard reports of excessive force at the hands of the San Francisco Police Department. I'm really proud to say that we have avoided some of the horrific videos that have come out of many cities across the country, from New York to Indianapolis to Buffalo and beyond. I have, however, seen an overwhelming and disproportionate police response to peaceful protests. I will not prosecute civil disobedience or peaceful exercise of First Amendment rights.
What are your thoughts on the curfew in San Francisco? Should that have been imposed?
I do not support curfews, particularly because looting and vandalism and arson are already crimes which the police are well equipped to arrest, investigate, and we're well equipped to prosecute. Curfews in a context like this serve one primary role, and that is to curtail peaceful, protected First Amendment activity.
You know, you came into office as a change candidate. This very much feels like a moment of change. Do you feel energized by it? Does it feel in line with your beliefs?
Absolutely. The movement that got me elected is the same movement that we are seeing in the streets from Chicago to Cincinnati, from New York to Nebraska. All across this country, people are excited for change. The majority of Americans are demanding urgent reforms to police policies and practices so that we can have a system where Black lives really do matter.
You made some change this week, at least a proposal, along with 7 San Francisco supervisors, and you proposed a resolution to prohibit the San Francisco Police Department from hiring any new officers with a known history of serious misconduct. And frankly, I think I was a little surprised by this. Is the San Francisco Police Department currently hiring new officers with a known history of previous misconduct?
So, Priya, we're now up to 9 members of the Board of Supervisors that are co-sponsoring that resolution. You got to wonder why the other 2 aren't willing to support a common sense policy that urges the Civil Service Commission to prohibit hiring officers with serious misconduct in their background. The reality is we don't know what exactly is happening and who's being hired, and it's a huge problem. The reason for that is California law creates a black box. It makes it very hard, if not impossible, for the public to know whether an officer has committed serious misconduct. We need to know, we need transparency, we need accountability, and we need to ensure that we are not putting people on our streets with guns, uniforms, and the ability to arrest if they have a history of serious misconduct.
And this resolution would only address new hires, not those who are already in the police department. Why isn't it broader?
That's correct, Priya. We are working on other reforms that would address people currently on the San Francisco Police Department. Really, we need to work with the Police Commission to ensure accountability and transparency and new policies. The Obama Department of Justice in 2016 issued a scathing report that highlighted 272 urgently needed reforms in the police department. Here we are 4 years later, and less than 15% of those reforms have been made. The time is now.
Why has it been so slow?
I think we see tremendous resistance from police unions. Former ACLU police accountability expert John Crew was just quoted in the press today saying that the police unions in this country are to police reform what the NRA is to gun control. They're a toxic influence on any effort to hold police accountable or to reform the ways in which our communities engage with law enforcement.
You know, the San Francisco Police Officers Union obviously spent a lot of money against you in the November election. This week, you and other DAs proposed banning unions from funding prosecutors in elections. Who's going to be making that decision, and what's the timeline?
Well, I want to be very clear on what we proposed. The Supreme Court of the United States has interpreted the First Amendment in a way that allows unions, including police unions, to spend unlimited money influencing local elections. Nothing in our proposal could or seeks to change that. What we are doing is asking the state bar and the American Bar Association to create an ethical rule that prohibits candidates for district attorney or current district attorneys from seeking political or financial support directly from police unions. It's to avoid a very real conflict of interest that presents itself every single time a district attorney's office, like my own, is tasked with investigating an officer's alleged excessive use of force or murder.
I want to turn now to an incident that happened in January. There was a young black man who was arrested, and during that arrest, a female San Francisco police officer put her knee on his neck in a method that seemed very similar to George Floyd. Now, there were 5 body cameras there on the police officers, but it wasn't until bystander video emerged in the last week that we're able to really see what happened in that situation. Once you viewed that bystander video, you dismissed all the charges against the young man, and you've also put a new policy into place by which all of your prosecutors have to review not only body camera footage, but also independent video footage before filing charges for resisting arrest or for other incidents. Now, my question here is, are you encouraging all San Franciscans to pull out their cameras and record all police action?
The reality is the more angles we can have recording a particular incident, the better job we can do charging the case. It's true with any kind of case, not limited to interactions with police, but we benefit tremendously from surveillance video footage from stores and markets all across the city when investigating and prosecuting cases. That's true in this instance as well. The video that we saw last weekend led me to personally take a close look at that case. And even more than the arrest itself, the other charge that had been the basis for the arrest was unfounded. We reached out to the alleged victims in the case. We did a closer read of the police report than had been done. And we realized that there never should have been an arrest made in the first place. And that's why I personally went to court on Monday morning and dismissed all charges.
Earlier this year, you fulfilled a campaign promise by eliminating cash bail in San Francisco. You see that as a form of systemized racism. The Police Officers Union says by eliminating cash bail, you're creating, quote, the largest criminal justice revolving door ever, and San Francisco will pay a price for it. What would you say to people who are worried that San Francisco is less safe now that you're district attorney?
Just look at the numbers. Crime is down significantly. In the last 2 months, crime across the city is down more than 35%. And the reality about money bail is it makes us less safe. Eliminating it makes us safer. I'll tell you why. It's very simple. Money bail is a system that allows wealthy people to buy their freedom no matter how dangerous they are, while poor people who are perhaps innocent, wrongly accused, or who present no public safety risk languish behind bars simply because of their poverty. It undermines public safety by allowing wealthy, dangerous people to buy their freedom, and it undermines the promise of equal protection by keeping poor people incarcerated. We've replaced that wealth-based system with a risk-based system, and we are all safer as a result.
San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Priya.
When cases of police violence against black people become public, protests often follow. There is talk of police reform, including the need for implicit bias training and reducing the use of force in order to prevent such misconduct from occurring again. But now we see a shift from talk of reform to proposals for cutting back on the number of police. This week, Los Angeles and San Francisco both announced they will cut police funding, sending the money instead to support services in minority communities. Joining me now by Skype from Wellfleet, Massachusetts, is Brooklyn College sociology professor Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing. And with us by Skype from Los Angeles is University of Southern California law professor Jody David Armour, author of Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Costs of Being Black in America. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us tonight.
You bet.
Jody, I want to start with you. You're an Angelino. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti has just announced that he would be taking as much as $150 million from the LAPD department and reinvesting it in communities of color. What's your reaction to that action?
That's the right move. That we're looking at the budget he initially proposed had almost 54% of the $5.5 billion roughly annual budget going toward the LAPD. That meant that was money that was not going towards social services, social workers, housing, education. You can walk through Skid Row down here in LA, one of the largest, really the largest homeless encampment in the country. So it's one of the fiercest expressions of structural violence in the country. And you look to your left and right and you see that 75% of the faces are black. Money could be going toward those folks, getting them out of that desperate plight and not going into the LAPD. So I think that's just the right move.
And Alex, here in San Francisco, one of the supervisors, Shaman Walton, and our mayor, London Breed, announced yesterday at a press conference that they're going to be redirecting a portion of law enforcement's budget to communities in need. Could you talk us through your vision of a radical restructuring of society based on our budgets and our law enforcement systems?
Yeah, you know what I've been advocating around the country is that communities should be doing very specific community needs assessments. They should be looking at what are the public safety challenges that they face that have essentially been turned over to police to manage, and then begin the process of identifying the kinds of specific targeted interventions that could address those problems in ways that don't rely on coercive and punitive methods, which are really the tools that the police have to deal with these problems. And then they need to make the kinds of demands of their elected officials to bring those resources in the community in a way that allows us to dial back our reliance on policing.
So Alex, if we're talking about large sums of the budget going towards law enforcement in Los Angeles, as we just heard, about 50%, Oakland has been 40% in the past, what percentage do you think of a budget should be spent on law enforcement?
Well, I don't think we know the answer to that. There's a huge variability in the way that this spending is organized. There's also a lot of hidden costs, hidden in pension funds and medical expenses. So I think this is about a process, not about some predetermined end goal. I think we start with the obvious things about removing police from schools and replacing them with counselors and restorative justice programs. We look at why we're using police to respond to mental health crisis calls, why we're using police to manage mass homelessness in our cities. And as we dial those things back, I think we'll get a better sense of what's going to be left at the end of this process.
All right. Jody, you've spoken in favor of police reform in the past, but you've since lost faith in reform. And I'd like to take Minneapolis as a case study. Minneapolis recently went through a 3-year, $5 million reform program to build trust between the community and the police through training such as implicit bias. Obviously, George Floyd's death represents a failing of reform measures there. But are there other metrics that you're using to measure the efficacy of police reform?
Yeah, whenever we have these incidents, it's like a wash, rinse, and repeat cycle. We convene a commission. We have venting by people at a hearing. Then we say, oh, body cams, oh, implicit bias training. And they haven't solved the problem. And so now we're hearing what you need to do is not protest in that particular way. Vote. Just, you exercise your franchise, cast that ballot, and that'll make a difference. Well, in some place like Minneapolis, you had Democratic mayor, city council, 13 out of 14 Democratic, in a lot of cities around the country, the marchers are seeing that even when you exercise the ballot, it doesn't seem to solve the problem. So the problem, I think, has to do with, number one, reducing the size of the police force so that we can divert some of those funds to crime prevention at the front end with social services and that sort of thing. Number two, then make sure the resources go toward getting at the kind of crimes that the Black community and every other community wants to have addressed. That is murder, rapes, violent assaults, robberies. When you have a lot of your resources going after turnstile jumpers and low-level nonviolent offenses, then they aren't going towards the kind of investigative work that it takes to solve murder. And so it's just a matter of reframing your priorities, also making sure that you take on the police unions and their collective bargaining agreements that often have built into them all kinds of protections for police. Charlie Beck, the former police chief here, said, I want to get rid of bad apples sometimes, but I can't because my hands are tied by the collective bargaining agreements. So making those kind of changes.
So, I'd like to take a look at the types of aggressive policing we're seeing now, even during these protests. In Los Angeles, there was a recent example of a woman being tased. There have been reports of police vehicles driving into crowds of protesters. Do you think this kind of behavior by law enforcement is going to lead to policy change right away? And Alex, I'll go to you with that.
Well, it's sad to say, but the police are making our argument for us. They're showing that these reforms have not worked. The implicit bias training, the de-escalation training, the efforts at professionalization and community police partnerships. When push comes to shove, we're seeing that police are, by their very nature, violence workers. And that when we turn problems over to the police to manage, there's going to be violence. And if we don't want that violence, we need to try to figure out other ways of managing our problems.
Alex, those are strong words. We're in a time of crisis, and I've spoken to many who say the police should definitely not be defunded right now. Maybe later, maybe they see a problem, but right now they want the police to keep them safe from violence that may break out in their neighborhood. What do you say to people who are worried that their safety will be reduced if police are defunded?
Well, of course, the disorder that we're seeing on the streets right now is the product of problematic policing. But no one's talking about a situation where tomorrow we just flip a switch and there's no police. This is about an ongoing process of critically examining the particular roles that we've turned over to police and developing alternatives as we go. So this is going to be a long-term process.
And Jody, for you, is there a place for police, or do you think they should be done away with altogether? How far are you going here?
Well, I'm not going all the way to abolition, but I am saying that I think folks are starting to recognize that building trust and confidence between the police and the community by making them adopt policies that are more humane and show more respect for the dignity of the people they're policing actually reduces crime. People are more willing to report crime. They're more willing to be witnesses against others. So in the long run, you're actually making yourself safer by making your police force more accountable, more transparent, and in some cases smaller.
Is there a place for police in our society?
Well, I want to just say that even the things that Jody mentions, homicides, rapes, we have a lot of good evidence about alternative ways to engage in preventative measures to try to reduce those problems rather than waiting for police to come and take a report. Let's look at the credible messenger model, the use of cure violence programs around the country to work with young people who are at risk of involvement in violence. These programs, when they're properly funded and well run, have shown dramatic success in reducing shootings and homicides without relying on policing and mass incarceration. And it's time for these big city mayors to take these programs seriously. We can't put them everywhere overnight. We need planning and we need to develop the programming that goes with them, but this is the future of reducing violence in our neighborhood.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Jody, David Armour, USC Gould School of Law, and Alex Vitale with Brooklyn College, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
As we've seen, the public outrage to George Floyd's killing has motivated tens of thousands of people across the nation to protest, even in the midst of a pandemic. While many are wearing face masks, gatherings of large crowds obviously make social distancing difficult. But protesters say racial inequality also results in poor health outcomes, which are reflected in the higher COVID-19 mortality rates among Blacks and Latinos. Joining me now by Skype is Dr. Rachel Hartshorn, an obstetrician and gynecologist who works in Alameda. She participated in a protest organized by her colleagues this week at Kaiser campuses in the East Bay. Kaiser Permanente did not officially sanction the event. Dr. Hartshorn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Was there a specific moment that catalyzed your decision to protest?
You know, that's really interesting because there wasn't a specific moment, and I actually had my doubts about what this protest would mean. So when I left the house that morning, I grabbed my Black Lives Matter sign out of my front yard, and I went to see what would happen. And it was really moving. There were 4 sites. We have Alameda, Richmond, Oakland, and Pinole. And it was with very little planning, a coordinated effort with people from the EVS staff to nursing to technicians and the physicians, a lot of the MAs. People came with their own handmade signs. I think they knew that it wasn't necessarily sanctioned by the organization, but nonetheless, they took to the streets outside of each respective site. And it was incredibly powerful that we took a knee for the length of about 9 symbolic minutes.
Dr. Hartshorn, do you believe there will be change that comes from these protests? What are you hoping for?
I'm hoping that there is change. There seems to be, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about what is different about this. You know, is it that it's a COVID pandemic? Is it that there was a trio of deaths? There's definitely more cell phone footage of these deaths, and they're just so violent. And something seems to have switched, and I'm hoping that will bring change. Change usually isn't handed down from the top, and so I don't necessarily expect that from the organization. I think one of the most beautiful parts of the protest was that it was a really classic example of civil disobedience. So here was... Yeah.
I just wanted to talk specifically, since you are an obstetrician and a gynecologist, about maternal health and the issues that impact Black lives, particularly more than white lives, from racial disparity, from stress, and how that impacts mothers and newborns.
So, there have been a lot of studies, and there have been a lot of hypotheses over time about why there are different outcomes in Black women compared to their white counterparts. And what it comes down to is that it seems like it's institutional racism. So when you control for all other factors, socioeconomic factors, education factors, you'll find that a woman who is very educated, who is upper class or who has enough means, will do poorly, more poorly than a poor white woman.
And how bad are these outcomes? How diverse and different are they?
So you're seeing an increase in hypertensive conditions of all types, gestational diabetes, pre-gestational diabetes, hemorrhages, and mortality. Black women are 2.5 to 3 times more likely, depending on where you are in the country, to die in childbirth.
It's shocking. And Dr. Hartshorn, can you tell us what you're seeing in your practice since the pandemic began? Are you seeing more stress in mothers?
Oh, absolutely. I'm seeing more stress in mothers across the board because we don't, this virus is so bizarre. And I think it's going to take time to see what the effects are long term specifically on maternal morbidity. And so women are very nervous. They're nervous. They want the best care, of course, for the best outcomes in their pregnancy. And this is a group of people, a group of patients that still need to be seen. So they're coming in, they're exposing themselves, they're not able to bring their partners. It's a scary time. We're now allowing a partner in labor. Mm-hmm. There was a while that they weren't sure that they'd be able to have their partners with them in labor. And so this is a really unique time where we're needing to provide that kind of reassurance in a way that we never had before, that they're going to be okay.
And as a healthcare practitioner, as you watch these protests online, as you've gone out and participated in them, what are your concerns about people gathering in large numbers like this?
So it's interesting because I've actually had people calling me, people who've taken this COVID pandemic and the orders to stay home very, very seriously, and yet they feel really compelled to protest. And I've had friends who haven't left their homes since the beginning ask, do I think it's safe? And so I've really done a lot of thinking about what's going on here. And if you look at what the World Health Organization defines as what we should be doing, they're really redefining that social distancing really should be called spatial distancing. And I think that that's an important
But
thing
that's
to
obviously still not something that can happen in these protests. People are much closer together.
They are closer together. And so, if you're talking about the specifics, I think that being outdoors is safer than indoors. I think that wearing a mask, mutually wearing masks is safer than not wearing any masks at all, or one person wearing a mask and the other one not. And so we're trying to be as safe as possible while we're spatially distancing but while we're socially connecting, because I think that social connection and solidarity is an important part of the health of society. And so what you have here is that people are willing to risk their lives. They're willing to take a risk. They're fully aware of what's going on. And it's very similar to what we're doing as healthcare practitioners, going in knowing that we're taking care of patients when there's some infectious risk. And so we're doing our very best with the tools that we have here in the Bay Area. And I think in many places we're on kind of the downslope of the curve. We're aware that there might be another spike later. Mm-hmm. But people are really passionate, so much so that they're willing to risk their lives to make a statement against the unmitigated police brutality. And they're willing to do it to say that Black Lives Matter.
Dr. Hartshorn, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me through my social media handle, Priya D. Clemens. Thank you for watching. Good night.